Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name's Phil Topham, Executive Director of the FIEC, and we're going to take our dive into the news. And with me is Head of National Ministries, Adrian Reynolds. Good morning, Adrian.
Hello.
And our National Director, John Stevens.
Good morning,
Good morning, John. Now, happy birthday to the podcast.
Yay.
So not only is FIEC 100 years old, 2 days left to book for the Leaders' Conference, by the way, if you're listening to this before Sunday, but also the podcast is a year old.
Does that make the podcast now a difficult toddler?
Yeah,
what sort
probably.
of stage of life is it?
It's cruising. It's just pulling itself up on the furniture.
Year a bit like different from a human year,
yeah,
like dog years.
It's really like in its early teens. I don't know. But anyway, a year of podcasts, and here we are. And one of the things we do in the podcast is talk about the news, the things that are going on. And the last time we recorded, it was the day before I got COVID, but also the day before Liz Truss resigned as Prime Minister. And suddenly here we are with another new Prime Minister. Let's start there.
I missed that. Have we got a new Prime Minister?
Well, there's interestingly, after the Leaders' Conference, I've got a 6-week gap till Christmas. I thought I'd have a go.
Yeah.
And then, see how we get on. But there we are. Rishi Sunak then, in all seriousness, is our new Prime Minister. And he comes in, doesn't he, to extremely difficult decisions. The problems that we were talking about a fortnight ago have not gone away. Yes, the markets have calmed slightly. I think that's fair to say. But still, major difficult decisions about the public finances, all the stuff that continues to go on about immigration, everything that's happened with Suella Braverman. None of this is straightforward for him. His in-tray is massive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that he's been appointed and there are all these huge challenges facing the nation. It is a little better than it was. I think the fact that sort of the markets, the cost of gilts and bonds has decreased, the cost of borrowing has decreased. The markets are obviously more confident about the future. There was something in the paper yesterday saying he's probably going to be about 15 billion better off as a result of that. So the circumstances are different. But yes, there's been a facing up to the reality of the challenge. And I think that the mini budget that Liz Truss put forward just simply brought home the reality of the economic challenge that we're facing. You can't simply borrow more money to fund kind of tax cuts. And it's a combination of cost of living, it's a combination of the Ukraine war, the COVID sort of consequences, food prices increasing. So yes, I mean, he faces massive challenges that need to be addressed. And I think coming out of the Liz Truss experiment, just a recognition that those challenges require a serious and difficult response, and they're going to be tough choices to make. But actually, the truth is most of us in the nation are going to have to make tough choices. So individuals are going to have to make tough choices about what they spend, how they use their money. Churches are going to have to make tough choices, perhaps, as they come into this period and they don't have the resources available to them that maybe they thought they would if they're impacted by cost of living and people naturally not able to give as much. So we're in an economic environment in which there is no easy solution. The reality is the nation has been living beyond its means for quite some time. That's partly economic policy coming out of the crash of 2008. It's also a result of COVID. And the way, to be fair to Rishi Sunak, people were supported through what was a very difficult time.
We've got to pay for that now.
But there comes a point at which you can't keep doing that because you're dependent on people lending you money. And I think what happened with Liz Truss is there was sort of the markets responded by she wanted to borrow more money, and frankly, because they didn't trust the ability to be repaid, essentially the interest rates rose. And that's exactly what lots of poor people face. Poor people can't borrow at low rates. They therefore have to borrow at much higher rates, higher credit cards, higher personal loans, payday loans. That's effectively what happened to the government. Suddenly it could no longer borrow at low kind of rates. One hopes that for the government, that might have brought home to them some of the realities of what poorer people are facing on a regular basis.
Now, some people are saying, Adrian, that actually the only way out of this is to change the government. General election now was one of the headlines this week. Certainly the opposition parties are calling for that. Labour well ahead in the polls. People in our churches might be thinking that as well. How can leaders help lead people through that? There's a genuine feeling, I think, of unrest in certain areas.
I think we do need to have confidence in our system. So we have a parliamentary democracy that works a certain way, and whether you like that or not, around the edges, on the whole, I think it's a good system. And actually, we elect a government, or we actually elect MPs, and then the person who can command a majority is elected to be Prime Minister, and technically First Lord of the Treasury, which is Rishi Sunak, who we'll come back to, I'm sure. So I think actually, I can't see the Conservative Party ever saying we're going to have a general election, because it's almost certain that they would lose. So why would they have it? And also they are confident in their own abilities. And at some level, I'm pleased about that. You know, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, you do want politicians who have an element of self-confidence. I mean, obviously, self-confidence can turn into pride and can be misplaced, as I think it probably was with Liz Truss. But actually, you do want people who have a sense of, you know, we know what direction we want to go in, and this is the way to go in it. And we've voted people in to do that. So I think, you know, it's wrong to say Boris Johnson had a mandate. I didn't vote for Boris Johnson. I was part of the electorate that voted in Neil O'Brien. He's our local MP. That's the way the system works. I think we need to be reminded of that. And I think on the whole, it's a system that served us very well down the years. So I think they should continue. Personally, I think that's a political view. It's not a particularly theological view. I think they should continue. And I think we need to give people confidence not only in the fact that it has served us well, this system, over the years. But actually, we believe in the sovereign God. We believe in God who rules over all things, to whom all kings have to bow down, and that's kind of our underlying confidence, isn't it? Which means that it doesn't make us apathetic about politics or involvement in society, but it does mean that we have this supreme confidence, actually, that we know our times are in His hands.
And Rishi Sunak's our first Hindu Prime Minister, John. How should Christians respond?
Well, not just Hindu, by the way. First person of colour to be Prime Minister.
Of course, yeah. So he's Asian as well, of course. Yeah. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary moment, isn't it? How should Christians respond to that?
And our youngest Prime Minister, since I think Pitt, who was 25 when he became Prime Minister, and Rishi Sunak is only 42.
Phil, there's hope for you in your 6-week window in terms of age.
I mean, at one level, I think that government is under God's common grace. It doesn't require a person of a particular faith position to be able to govern well. Many of our prime ministers have been effectively sort of atheists or agnostics or Christians in only the very loosest sense.
Didn't Boris Johnson call himself a very, very, very bad Christian?
He did, and I think that's a rare moment of personal insight on his part. He did become a kind of a Catholic and convert to the Catholic faith, but he did at least have the grace to admit that he's a very, very bad Christian. And I think everybody can know from his private life that sort of would certainly be the case. So I don't think we need a prime minister who has a particular faith commitment to be able to govern sort of well. We want somebody with competence, with integrity, with honesty. In fact, we don't know to what extent Rishi Sunak's Hinduism affects his particular decision making, because like every religion, there are those who are committed adherents and those for whom it's more of a cultural kind of background. And we honestly don't know, I think, what the situation is in relation to Rishi Sunak. The Bible tells us to pray for those who are raised up by God to rule over us, irrespective of their faith. So in the New Testament, they were being asked to pray for kind of pagan Roman emperors and governors who were sort of in many ways kind of abusive and tyrannical leaders, but yet they were praying that God would use them to be able to govern sort of with justice. I think actually it's an indication of the multiracial, multi-faith nature of Britain today that Rishi Sunak is able to become kind of Prime Minister and almost unremarked, unnoticed on. It's not seen as being some radical step. And I think you look at the current kind of cabinet and there's a high degree of ethnic diversity kind of represented within the cabinet. 2 of the great offices of state are held by people kind of colour. And again, I think this is part of the nature of our modern country. We need to remember that the numbers of practicing Christians in the UK is only about 6%. The number of evangelicals is only 2 or 3%. It's not particularly surprising that we have a political class, a cabinet, prime minister who don't sort of reflect that kind of Christian faith.
It's worth saying, I think, that for many Christian leaders and many Christians in churches, they see the other great faith that's exercised in the UK as being Islam, and will know a little bit about it. And depending on your context as a church, you may even know quite a bit about it. But I'm guessing, except in a very few places, there aren't many church leaders and church members who have a good grasp of what Hinduism is. I don't think it gets quite the headlines. So it'd be interesting to, just to think, to ask leaders, do you know what Hindus believe? Do you know what their moral code is and why they have it? Do you know what the Hindu position is on, for example, abortion? And I think probably most people will not be able to answer that. I think the other thing about Rishi that's interesting is his teetotal. And the Westminster drinking culture is being seen, rightly so, I think, as increasingly toxic. It's essentially what gives rise to a lot of the sexual impropriety that we see conducted at Westminster. I mean, the number of MPs that have resigned or had to be suspended over the last year is extraordinary, really. And it's normally they're drunk at a bar or drunk in the Commons bar or whatever it is. So I think actually, in terms of leading by example, perhaps it's not bad having a Prime Minister who's teetotal. He is a Coke addict, which could come out the wrong way.
Yeah,
Coca-Cola.
as in the sparkling drink. Let's be clear about that.
But he doesn't drink. And I think actually that's not a bad thing.
I think in a globalised world, most countries are now becoming multi-ethnic, multi-faith. That's part and parcel of the way that we are today. And that's been a radical change in the last 50 years. And so we're having to navigate, how do we sort of manage as nations to embrace that full kind of diversity. In the past, there was an assumption that everybody would share a particular religion. That would perhaps be imposed in large measure. In many ways, that experiment didn't work and didn't sort of last. But out of that emerged the principles of freedom of religion, the tolerance of others. So actually, the Prime Minister doesn't dictate the principles in the UK in terms of freedom of religion. Those are established by sort of long precedent, by the Constitution, by the law, by statute, by human rights, and those are protected. And it would be very difficult, I think, for those to be overturned by any prime minister or sort of government unless they had an absolutely overwhelming majority, in which case it would be a kind of a tyranny of the elected kind of government. So I think we can take great confidence that actually those freedoms are protected and really important, and they're extended to all. And as Christians, we ought to both value them and defend them. And that actually means defending them for all. If we want religious freedom for Christians, then that means we have to be willing to want a Hindu to be a prime minister or a Muslim to be a prime minister, as long as they operate within the constitutional framework that's established.
Well, we've talked a bit about Hinduism. Can we talk a little bit about Islam? In particular, things that are happening in Iran, where there's been all these protests after the death of a woman in custody who apparently her hijab was not being worn properly. I thought it'd be worth talking about that, and also thinking a bit about the upcoming World Cup in Qatar, another Islamic country, and there's been quite a lot written, said about that in recent times. First of all, there are incredible scenes in Iran.
They are, and I think we just need to acknowledge as well that that these things are going on all the time in places around the world, and we're very channeled by what we see on the news, and we're quite naive, I think, when it comes to world affairs. So it's interesting how little, on the whole, world affairs, looms large on the news or in newspapers or even actually in elections. So, you'd think at the moment that the only crisis in the world is in Ukraine. Obviously, that's a very deep crisis, but there are some very significant things happening around the world. And there are some very oppressive and repressive regimes that actually we hear very little about and frankly do very little about. And Iran is one of those. And actually it's obviously come to the fore because of the question of hijab wearing and someone who was killed because of not wearing hijab, and just the response to that. And actually it's just a reminder that there are very repressive regimes, aren't they? And we've been working through as a church the World Watch List that Open Doors produced, found that very helpful, just a reminder actually that the normal life actually for a Christian is around the world is often to live in one of these repressive regimes. But even this isn't Christians in Iran. This is there are 800,000 Christians in Iran. This is Muslims who are being repressed, who are looking for some greater freedoms. So I think just generally we need to understand and we need to have our eyes open, don't we, to what's going on in the world.
And linked to that is Qatar as well, where the World Cup will take place. Another regime which seems to have an appalling human rights record, from what I'm reading.
Well, I think that's true of the Gulf states. They're desperate to want to try to connect with the Western world. You see, not that just in Qatar wanting to host the kind of World Cup, you see that in Saudi Arabia with them wanting to build this new kind of mega city and kind of connect. So in a way, they want to integrate within the Western world and have the advantages of that. You see the growth of tourism and business in sort of Dubai, but yet at the same time, they're ruled by kind of authoritarian Islamist regimes. And in Qatar, the point of conflict there is the point of their sort of attitudes towards LGBT people. Homosexuality is kind of illegal. It can be punished by imprisonment. And yet, of course, the World Cup and world football has been wanting to advocate for LGBTQ rights within the game. Those who've been willing to come out and admit that they're footballers who are homosexual. And that's the tension. Qatar is one of something like 69 countries around the world that still make homosexuality kind of illegal and criminalise it. And so there's an immense tension there in terms of kind of Islamic values and the law as against this desire to want to connect with the rest of the world. And at one level, It's the corruption that's been involved in the game going there. It's been the abuse of the builders who have been constructing the stadium. That's shone a spotlight on the nature of Qatari society and the nature of these societies. And the politicians have responded. So James Cleverly this week was saying to football fans at one level, go to kind of Qatar, enjoy the game, but basically don't express your kind of gay identity as much as you would do.
Huge backlash
where you're going there.
for saying that, though, wasn't there? Huge backlash for him for saying that, particularly from the Labour Party. I think Gary Lineker, and others. That, I mean, is that good advice?
Well, I think it's difficult. At one level, you are going to a country where that is the law, and at one level, what do you expect to say to somebody who goes to a country where that is the law? You would advise any tourist who was travelling to a country where homosexuality is illegal.
So just desensitise it a bit. There are heavy restrictions in Qatar on alcohol, but they are making certain allowances for alcohol to be consumed in certain places. So if James Cleverly had stood up and said, if you're going to Qatar, don't walk down the street with an open bottle of beer. You're going to get in trouble. It's the law. You've got to respect that. There probably wouldn't have been the same backlash. So I think we have got to just desensitise it a little bit to see how it sort of fits in with the whole picture of what's going on in Qatar, not just the question about homosexuality.
So I think it's that tension of what you do if you go into a country that does have its own kind of rules, its own laws. You can't expect to go and live as you wish and for there to be no consequences of that because you're going into somebody else's kind of country. At the same time, the bigger issue is, should that be the position in the law sort of anyway? So Peter Tatchell mounted a campaign in kind of Qatar earlier this week for sort of LGBTQ kind of rights. And we need to remember that in the UK, homosexuality was criminalised until I think it was 1967. So it's not that long ago that even the UK changed its position. But attitudes have changed. I think from a Christian perspective, I'm not in favour of the criminalisation of homosexuality. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's essential. I don't think that's helpful for tolerance. I don't think that's helpful for kind of freedom. I want the freedom for the church to be able to teach that sexual relationships are only appropriate for heterosexual marriage, and as for us to continue to be able to practice that and live that out. I think that's right. But I don't think that the Bible teaches that we should, in a sense, criminalise those who choose to live in a different way. That's not the kind of approach that's adopted in the New Testament. You don't see the church advocating for that in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6. It speaks about how you live alongside people who live differently. You don't cut yourself off from them. The gospel agenda is to be a distinct Christian community that is sharing the good news with others. And I think in the end, it will be self-defeating for cultures to be able to try to criminalise LGBTQ communities. It's unlikely to produce the kind of tolerant society that will benefit everyone.
I'm pretty sure FIFA wouldn't have given Qatar the Women's World Cup.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think that the World Cup thing's interesting because I think it's naive, is it not, to think that football can really change the attitudes of a country. So 4 years ago, where was the World Cup? Russia. I mean, it would be extraordinary to think that Russia could hold the World Cup this year, but yet 4 years ago they did. And suddenly we've got the World Cup going to Qatar. It doesn't look good, in my opinion. Is it naive to think that football could change?
Well, I think that's part of a huge question, which is to do with the way that FIFA is run and managed, and where money went, and which isn't, it's ongoing investigation, isn't it? And there have been prosecutions which actually have failed in terms of some of the officials. So I just think it's a too big a question for us to tackle, Phil. Are you going to watch it?
The World Cup?
Yeah.
What time's kickoffs? Are they a normal time?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
So the World Cup final's on a Sunday at 3:30 or 3 o'clock, I think.
England will do terribly, in my opinion.
Is that right?
I just think they will do terribly. I just think it's not in good form.
I think England will get to the final. I just feel that we need to be able to look back on this podcast and say one of us was a prophet.
Okay, so, well, there we are.
England will get at least to the final.
We'll get Joel to play a clip of it when we do the news pod after the World Cup. Sorry, John.
One further thing on this. I think actually Rishi Sunak has said that he's not going to the World Cup. The King has said he's not going to the World Cup. But actually,
Prince William as well.
And Prince William.
The reason has been given is too busy. And you kind of think that's actually a cop-out. Actually, if you're not going because of the position that they hold, then actually to simply kind of fabricate, and I'm not able to go because I'm too busy, which nobody really believes anyway, is actually to fail to address the issue. So it seems to me that, again, there's a lesson for us there as Christians. We don't simply cop out of things because we disagree with them. We don't, refuse to kind of go to work and take part in the kind of gay pride sort of event because we're too busy. There's a right and proper place for saying, I'm not willing to participate with that, but we give the real reason for that.
I've heard Christians say they won't watch it even. As a protest.
Interesting.
Quite how that's going to register as a protest, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, but it's good. It's good to take a position on it, isn't it? I mean, I don't like it as a football fan. I don't like the fact that the World Cup's gone to Qatar.
Yeah, well, you don't like the World Cup anyway.
I don't.
You're a Bolton fan.
More of a club fan.
There aren't too many internationals operating at that level.
You've revealed my hand there, Adrian. But yeah, very good, very good. And I do want to stick, if I may, with football. Sorry,
yes, let's.
You're not a football fan, but this is really about leadership, I think, rather than football.
Are we going to talk about Jürgen?
Yeah, this is the fine given to Jürgen Klopp for his outburst in the Liverpool-Manchester City game, where he was particularly miffed, is an understatement, about one of the decisions that was made by the referee. He's been fined £30,000 for his outburst. There's something in there, isn't there, about the example that leaders set, that he as a manager
I think so.
set?
I mean, it's worth saying, by the way, £30,000 is a drop in the ocean to Jürgen Klopp on his salary, so it's not going to hurt him too much. And he was apologetic.
He was, immediately, really.
If you see the pictures, and you can just Google them and the stills, it is extraordinary, him standing over the referee right in his face. I mean, it is extraordinary behaviour, really, for any adult, I think. And I think Jürgen Klopp, as the manager of the team, has to set an example to his players. So he's older than the players. He's old enough to be the father of many of the players. And I think the manager has to set an example into how to behave, especially towards officials. And there is actually a groundswell within the football community of tackling bad behaviour towards officials, especially at lower leagues and non-leagues, grassroots. People referees talking about refereeing under 11s and being abused and chased off in their cars by parents, and it was extraordinary stories, really. And I think Jürgen does have he does have an obligation to lead by example, which is a very biblical idea. So the idea of leading by example, we're not just to teach what is right. Paul says to Timothy, command and teach these things. So you are to teach. Don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. And I think we have to understand that as leaders, we are to set an example, and whether we like it or not, people will look to us for an example. So I think when you see in leaders aggression, anger, bitterness, poor behaviour of any kind, really, just neglecting basic Christian virtues, I think I just think it's tragic to see, and it's increasingly common, it seems to me.
I think that's entirely right, and I think the New Testament tells us that people who are unable to control their tempers simply shouldn't be in leadership. It's not appropriate that they should be in local church leadership. Fits of rage is one of the kind of acts of the flesh that is meant to be kind of put to death by the Spirit, replaced with a kind of a gentleness. And you see the qualifications for church eldership in sort of Timothy and Titus, and it includes being gentle rather than being quarrelsome and violent. So that being given to fits of temper when under pressure actually means that a person doesn't have the maturity and the character to be in leadership. Interesting, lots of those qualities for leadership in those passages are all about dealing with difficult people in difficult circumstances. You've got to be able to control yourself and exercise self-control in those moments. It's not just Jürgen Klopp. There was James Corden, who kind of sort of exploded in temper at a restaurant because of the way that he was served. Again, that's another example. And temper often comes from not getting what you want, not having what you desire. Your world is the world doesn't conform to what you think is kind of right. Now, I think there's a difference between somebody who sort of loses their temper, a one-off event in circumstances, and what is a pattern of behaviour. That this is how they characteristically kind of treat people for which they're unrepentant, and they begin to kind of justify it. And we saw that to some extent in the kind of situation at Mars Hill in Seattle with Mark Driscoll and the podcast that was then done after that. One of the characteristics was temper in ways of dealing with other leaders and other people in the church. And frankly,
in a pattern, not just
absolutely. And
one-off
if that's the case, a person simply should not be in kind of local church leadership because they lack the character qualities that are essential for that.
Without trying to get too sound too self-righteous, I try and read through the fruit of the Spirit regularly, if not daily, not quite daily, but I come back to it regularly. I do think it's a great stopping off point for leaders. We do want to be skilled up in all kinds of leadership qualities, but actually the basic Christian virtues are the bedrock not only of Christian living but leadership too. And we've got a little series, actually, little videos that you can use as leaders to go through the fruit of the Spirit. I think it's well worth coming back to again and again, because actually leaders who are filled with the Spirit will display the fruit of the Spirit. And that's the guard. The leadership prayer actually every day is, Lord, fill me with your Spirit, that I might be more like Jesus. That's the key prayer for leadership. And I think actually that needs to come before, help me preach a good sermon, help me make wise decisions, help me lead this meeting well. All those things are good to pray for, but actually before all of that comes, Lord, fill me with your Spirit to make me more like Jesus.
Yeah. And Philippians 4, we were looking at in the prayer meeting yesterday morning, let your gentleness be evident to all. Absolutely. Just coming back to Jürgen Klopp, interesting that he did apologise, and he evidently recognised that was unbecoming, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of, biblically, when we fail, we repent, we seek to change, we seek to be transformed, we seek to live differently. And yeah, absolutely. He puts his hands up, acknowledges that that's not acceptable, is prepared to take the punishment that goes with that. And that's exactly how we should respond when we sin and when we fall into sin. Actually, sometimes I think people don't do that because they fear they won't be forgiven. And I think there's a lot of talk in Christian circles about how leaders should repent. And sometimes they don't want to do that because they're in a culture in which one failure is seen as being kind of disqualifying or whatever. I mean, there are some failures that do disqualify. A person who commits adultery or whatever is going to be disqualified by one failure. But with patterns of character, leaders maybe are reluctant to repent and acknowledge that because they fear it will be used against them. And also, I think in the Christian community, we can not be a community of grace to others because we assume people are to live by this higher standard, and we find it very difficult to recognize that everybody falls short in various ways. So it requires a community of grace for people to be able to easily repent and be forgiven and be restored.
John, when we were preparing for the podcast, you said we could ask the question, what should we get angry about? So can I ask you that question?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's a sort of a difference between kind of fits of temper against other people, and there's a sort of a righteous anger, a righteous indignation at injustice. I was thinking beforehand, I mean, David, for example, with David and Goliath, is in a way rightly angry with the way that Goliath is insulting the name of God and the way that God is being dishonoured sort of by him. So there are right and proper places for us to be able to have a concern for God, a concern for God's honour, a concern for vulnerable people who are being oppressed and being kind of mistreated. But those are about genuine injustices and dishonourings in the world. The situations we've been talking about, Jürgen Klopp and James Corden, are much more about personal affront and not getting my will done. But there's a right and proper place for an anger when we see God's will not being done and people being mistreated as a result of that. But we've got to be very careful because in our hearts we can easily confuse those two things.
And I think that's and actually when you're thinking about God's name being dishonoured and others being dishonoured, it's easier to understand your heart and work out what's going on because it's not you that's at stake generally. I think when it's personal, I find it extraordinarily difficult. Maybe this is just me. I find it very difficult to work out what in my heart is righteous anger and what is unrighteous anger. And therefore, I always err on the side of caution, try to avoid all anger. But I think there is a kind of righteous anger which is good and proper and not to be exalted in, but to say, yes, this is part of being made in God's image and having a renewed heart. But I do think we need to be able to self-diagnose. Maybe I'm saying I need to self-diagnose better than I do, because actually our emotions are complex and how we relate to things, that is complex. And very often I think the anger that we justify as righteous anger is actually essentially a form of pride.
And I think very often biblically we're not even meant to hold on to righteous anger, but actually to give it over to God. Yeah. There's that sense in which actually vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And the way we liberate ourselves from anger is recognizing that God is righteously angry about those things. And he is perfectly angry without sin, without any of that confusion. And actually very often what we need to do is hand it over to God.
Yes, who is in full possession of the facts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely right. Well, brothers, thank you so much for talking about the news with us this morning. Don't forget, you've got, I think it was about 48 hours to book for the Leaders' Conference if you've not already.
How many are coming for?
I think we've got 970 booked in as of today. So we might just hit 1,000 over the next couple of days.
If you are listening to this before the Leaders' Conference, which is 7th to 9th of November, do pray for us.
Please.
Obviously, pray for all the work that needs to be done to get it ready. It's quite a big event to put on. But we really want it to be an encouraging and useful time. We want people who come to be built up in their faith and in their ministry. And we do recognise that some people will come full of the joy of the Lord. Perhaps they've just come off a Sunday baptising someone or seeing someone converted. Other people will come very low and weary. And we do want to be serving one another. So do pray for a really good spirit. I think one of the things that I've organised lots of conferences in my life. One of the things I love about the FIEC conference is there is a really good spirit at it. And if you can pray for that, I think that would be a great thing to be commending to the Lord.
That is a great place to finish. Brothers, thanks very much. It's been good to chat about the news. Do rate and review the podcast so others can find it. I hope you found it helpful. And we'll see you in Blackpool or look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thanks very much.
Happy birthday.
Phil.